So I'm glad to start the third session in this conference about political violence. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to coordinate this session. So political violence is a form of violence that is perpetrated in order to achieve political goals and to maintain the power in the hands of the occupier and the colonialist. And it includes, it can be perpetrated in different ways. It can include confiscation of lands, house demolition, structural discrimination, and racial segregation, and sometimes also abuse of police force. Many studies show that political violence is an important determinant of health. Today, we have two presentations by Dr. Osama Tanous and by Dr. Benjamin Bouquet. So we'll start with Dr. Osama Tanous, who is a pediatrician, and he is also a public health specialist. He is based in Haifa, and currently he is in the US, in Davis, and also let me see, just sent me his CV. Yes, in Emory University as well. So Osama is going to a presentation, will focus on homicide among Palestinians in Israel and an unrecognized public health crisis. Dr. Osama, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I would like to thank the audience and the Lancet Palestine Health Alliance for accepting the abstract. My name is Osama Tanous. I'm a pediatrician and a public health scholar. And I'm speaking to you currently from Emory in Atlanta. I'm doing a fellowship in public health and health policies. I will be talking about homicide as a public health crisis among the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So, okay. I will start with laying out the problem, the theoretical framework, try to describe how a ghetto is created, and then present our research. So homicide among the Palestinians in Israel has been truly been seen as a public health emergency since 2000, and these numbers are true till last year. More than 1,466 Palestinian citizens of Israel have been the victim of homicide. It is one of the leading causes of death among young male Palestinians, and it is a burning and threatening issue. Okay. Just a brief background, the Palestinians in Israel are less than 20% of the population, but their percentage as victims of homicide has increased from 50% to more than 70%. And while 71% of the homicide cases among the Jewish Israelis are solved by the police, less than 50 are solved by, for the Palestinians in Israel. And Palestinians in Israel have a relative risk of dying from homicide compared to an Israeli Jew. And this is just to show you the extent of the problem. So while in the West Bank, this is for the year 2018, with 2.8 million population, there has been 24 cases of homicide among Jewish Israelis, 35 cases for 6.5 million population. The Palestinians in Israel, while having only 1.8 million population, 81 homicide cases, and this is for 2018. For 2019 and 2020, it's even higher numbers. So it is they are disproportionately affected. How can we make sense of this? The CDC urges us to think of violence as a public health problem to be solved and not a fact of life. It urges us to use public health approaches used for infectious diseases and chronic diseases and think beyond individual characteristics and to focus on social factors. In that paper, the CDC urges us to think of racism and sexism, social and economical disparities, how that lead to a lack of opportunities for success in school and then at work, that creates to poverty and joblessness, frustration, low self-esteem, family instability, and all of that promotes violence. If we can think of structural violence, it is the cause of difference between what the potential and the actual, the social order, the system of stratification, the source of violence that limits human potential, and that generates unnecessary and avoidable suffering. I will try to frame the homicide, the cases of actual violence as a product of structural violence that the Palestinians face inside Israel. What is dangerous about structural violence is that it can become accepted as normal. And while personal violence is theatrical and spectacular, structural violence is very silent. It doesn't show, it's essentially static. It is just like tranquil water. It is the world that we are born into. It is hegemonic all around us and as natural as the air that surrounds us. Paul Farmer, in his works, describes the social arrangement that put individual and population in harm's way, how the stratification of society, how in its structure of poverty, social inequality, racism, can promote human rights abuses and thus promote structural violence. I think besides structural violence, settler colonialism is a framework that that is crucial for our understanding of the Palestinians inside Israel. And it is significantly different from other forms of colonialism, which is exogenous domination and the foreign invaders ruling a territory. In settler colonialism, we are talking about a settler community that replaces the original population of the colonized with a new society of settlers. It is a violent depopulation of the indigenous population, and that sees the settlers as racially superior, and it is very much about the sovereignty, the political sovereignty of the new settler population. I will try to explain how these frameworks join together and how a ghetto is created through the creation of poverty, overcrowded communities, limited access to high-earning job, and limited access to education, and how ghetto creates violence. So if we can have a brief history of the Palestinians in Israel, we can think of the year 1948, the Nakba, where the majority of the Palestinians were expelled from their homeland and only a minority stayed. So a minority stayed in what became to be known as Israel, that defined itself as a Jewish democratic state. These Palestinians from 1948 to 1966 were subjected to military rule, and that was an era of massive land confiscation. Then there was the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. The land that occurred while Palestinians were resisting land confiscation, then the first and second Intifada, the nation law in 2018 that clearly states that Israel is the state of the Jewish people, which and sees a value in Jewish settlement of the land, and Arabic no longer became a official language. And with 2020, we're seeing the planned annexation of the West Bank settlements. How that is relevant to our cases. So we can see throughout these different policies of state violence and structural violence, Palestinians have been subjected to decades of land confiscation and discriminatory planning policies. In Israel, 93% of the land is state land, which means it is meant for the development of Jewish communities, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel, while almost 20% of the population live on less than 3% of the land. Many of the Jewish communities have admission committees that ban Palestinians from living in Jewish localities. And this creates a situation where Palestinian communities are far more crowded than their Jewish neighboring communities. So here we can see a clear demonstration of Jisr al-Zarqa and how crowded it is compared to neighboring Caesarea or Ma'gan Mikhael. And this is the case in many Palestinian towns. Poverty. So, of course, poverty is much more common among the Palestinians in Israel. Almost 50, more than half of the population lives in poverty, much more than the Jewish population. Almost 2/3 of Palestinian children grow up in poverty. And here we need to understand poverty as a produced poverty. It has been produced through the loss of land. That's how Palestinians in Israel have transformed from farmers who owned land and were making sustenance from it into unskilled wage laborer that had to integrate in the Israeli job market. In terms of education, of course, much less budgets have been invested in schools in the Palestinian localities. So the school dropout rate for Palestinians in Israel is almost double that of the Jewish Israelis. Jewish school pupils receive a much higher investment in budgets, and the Palestinians graduate from high school significantly lower compared to the Jewish Israelis. Arab schools are overcrowded and understaffed. So we can think how these policies also of land confiscation, produced poverty, and the lack of investment in education have led to Palestinian towns in Israel being impoverished racial enclaves that look like this. They're very crowded with no infrastructure, marginalized and racialized. A small point about culture has been often used in ways of trying to explain why Palestinians suffer from much higher rates of crime and violence. And here we need to be very careful because culture can be used in order to enforce separation, to create a hierarchy where one culture is better than the other, one culture is more violent or prone to violence than the other. And this is a popular and subtle tool used to blame a particular group for a certain behavior, saying that this population is this and that, believes in this and so, without really digging into a deeper analysis of what has led to that. And we can see that also we can debunk this argument with the large difference in the rate of crime between Palestinians who live in Israel and those who live in the West Bank and Gaza that have much lower crime rate that supposedly share the same culture. So our research has been conducted with the Galilee Society in Shwamir, the Arab National Society of Research and Services, and the Institute of Public Health in Birzeit. Our goals was to examine the attitudes of Palestinians in Israel towards violence, crime, and safety. We took a very large sample in 2018 of almost 2,000 households. It was a stratified, multi-staged random sample in different localities, different regions, from the north to the south. And we can see that, first of all, a very large percentage of the population, almost 2/3, evaluated the violence to be high or moderate in their communities, the prevalence of violence. Almost half of the population estimated that the violence has increased in the last year. Almost half believe that they can be a possible target of violence, and almost 3/4 believe that the use of weapon has become normalized in everyday disputes. The majority of the people see crime as the biggest challenge facing the Palestinian society today, almost 52%, followed by racist laws, poverty, and then other issues. So it is a huge issue, and it's seen as a threatening issue in everyday life. 3/4 of the population is estimated that the state is interested in the spread of crime. Also, a large percentage, more than 80%, believe that government's lack of interest in has fueled the spread of unauthorized weapons in the Palestinian community. A similar percentage believe that the police is complicit in the spread of unauthorized weapon in the community. And 70% see that the police doesn't deal with crime severely or sufficiently. So we can see a clear pattern of distrust in the government or in the police in its willingness to fight crime, or that they're partially complicit in the problem. And when we looked at the trust in the police in different localities, we saw that unrecognized towns, that is mainly Bedouin towns in the Naqab, had much lower trust in the police. Mixed towns where Arab and Jewish live together, like Akka, Yafa, have much less trust in the police. Large towns and people who are poorer had much less trust in the police. So we can summarize that structural violence and settler colonialism produced a crime-friendly environment that had high level to exposure to violence and crime. The majority report lack of interest or complacency of the Israeli government in addressing the problem. Trust in the government and the police in its commitment to fight crime is low, and it is a public health emergency that requires attention and strategic treatment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tanous, for this very interesting presentation about the mechanisms of for political violence and homicide among Palestinians in the Green Line. I think we can have 1 or 2 questions before we move to the next presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Nehaya, and thank you for the audience for joining.
Thank you, Osama. Any questions to Dr. Osama? So, Osama, I think I have a question. I think your work reminds us very much of the theory of Samson theory about the broken windows. That was published in the Science in 1997. Do you think that there are also economic, determinants behind violence in the Palestinian Arab villages and towns currently?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nehaya. Yeah, that's an excellent question. And, while reading about it, because naturally most of the theories about homicide and crime are produced in the USA, right? So the broken windows and a lot of the theories about the black ghettos in the US and so on. And I think what's interesting is that, the USA has a very different reality because the community is mobile, and then poverty and class organization is different, right? Because if you have more money, you'll simply move to a better neighborhood and so on. And this is not the case for us, right? Because the community is not mobile. So because they have no ability, right? The cities have been destroyed. There is no, the job market is very different. And then, unlike the US, where mixing seems to be the solution, right? That segregated communities are seen as more violent. With us, with the Palestinian communities, it's the opposite, to the contrary. And we've seen it last year, right? Like cities like Akka, Yafa, Led, so on. The mixed cities are, to the contrary, more violent and have less trust in the police, right? Because the mechanism of how these urban spaces have been, you know, kind of destroyed in 48 as an urban fabric, and then you have ghettos inside the cities, and now our villages have simply become large ghettos. So I think it's like I try to make sense of the broken windows and try to apply it to our communities, but then it really is different, right? And it's hard to study a class as a factor in the Palestinian communities, because even the rich and the poor will live on the same street, right? And they will behave differently, right? They will have a larger house or so on, but I still couldn't try to understand how their exposure to crime is different, right?
Okay, thank you, Osama. We have other questions I see here in the chat. One question is about solutions. What could be the solutions, and if community-based approach can be one of these solutions? The question of Graham, Dr. Watt, is about research, how these research results are interpreted by Israelis. Does it stigmatize the Arab population in Israel? Because we know that, you know, many are going now to higher education. We have, yesterday we had just finished 1 year of a program for PhD students, female students. We have now 600 PhD students among Palestinian women, only Palestinian women. So how this can actually be explained and interpreted by the Palestinians? You know, when we present the Palestinians with these numbers of homicide, how it can be interpreted not just in Israel, also internationally, because I think we need also to bring the positive picture about Palestinians inside Israel, how strong this community had been, you know, standing and also protecting their rights on the land for over 70 years. So I think it's very important to mention that.
Yeah, of course, and thank you. That's really an interesting question, and of course, I don't have a clear answer, because I myself I have been struggling with this, and the whole phenomena of crime and violence, and maybe correct me, Dr. Nehaya, if I'm wrong, is very much seen as like the phenomena of the last 20 years. You know, we traditionally view our communities and our villages as safe communities. You know, when I was growing up in the like 80s, 90s, whatever, it was very safe to go. Like people had very little weapons. There was they were seen as communities that people know each other, you know, and they are kind of there was even less, you know, stealing and so on. You could walk at night. And this whole wave of crime, you know, took us by, I think it was shocking. And a lot of it started after 2000, right? After the year 2000, after the second Intifada. There has been a lot of analysis on that, on how the Israeli community targeted crime in the Israeli Jewish communities, and kind of then it went to the backyard, to the Arab communities by gangs and so on. And of course, you know, Palestinians generally, I think inside Israel and outside, have a strong drive towards education. You can see it everywhere. People really know that the job market is very competitive, and you always have a drive to do the very best, and especially for women, because they suffer from double oppression and so on. So and of course, it's, you know, we have a lot of positive things, but these are the facts, and it has nothing to do with you know, we are the product of systems, right? And if you grow up in a system, in a community or in an environment that encourages you to behave in a certain way, you will. And you know, unsurprisingly, our communities have become friendly to crime, because there is no, they're kind of they are surveilled very much by the police, you know, but not in the case of crime, right? So they would arrest young people when they try to organize a demonstration, to fight land confiscating and so on. And we saw that in the very, you know, in the last campaign by the Israeli police. So it's very much surveillance, you know, surveillance, but and policed, but not when it comes to crime. And then there is no enforcement mechanism, and simply it encourages people to, some sort of people, to behave that way. And of course, culture is a very racist argument, right? Because it's the homicide is much higher than in the West Bank and in Gaza, and people that are the same people, right? And this has been also debunked in the US when they say, the Black people have that kind of culture, or Latinos have this and that. So of course it's a stigmatizing racial event, and people are. And I think the solution would be, of course, much more structural. It has to do with because people fight over everything, right? Also, where to park the car, where to build the house, where to use this and that. It's kind of a pressure pot of thousands of people, you know. So the solution, of course, would have to be political.
Yeah, thank you, Osama. We have another question, but I have to mention one comment that was a fact that was published 2 weeks ago in the news, in the Israeli news, that I think, and this is one thing that can be added to your study: who is the perpetrator? Because many of the perpetrators are not from the local Palestinians; they are actually persons who work with the Israeli security agency that came and live in the Palestinian villages and towns, and they are responsible for this homicide. They are, they have weapons that Palestinians can't actually buy weapons in Israel, and those actually are planted inside the Palestinian community. I think this is something that is very important to mention when we are trying to also to analyze violence inside the Palestinian towns and villages. I think we all thought that this is a conspiracy, that we thought that, the Israeli government is doing this for us, but it is a real fact now that we know, because the police was actually stating this publicly in the news. Manal Masalha, you have a question.
Yes, sorry. Thank you, Osama. I kind of listened to the presentation in and off because, or on and off, because I have my son homeschooling today. But it's really interesting. So thank you, Osama, and thank you, Nehaya. I wanted actually, before you mentioned the point, Nehaya, the recent news about, or the declaration from the police authorities within Israel that the perpetrators, or those who are, carrying out violence, which is now endemic within the Palestinian society in Israel, actually are also, they call them mashtapim, which is collaborators. I might disagree with you actually that these perpetrators are like from outside the community. They are from within the community. Yeah. So it's not, I don't think they are from outside the community. So we cannot, I think, analyze violence, which is, as I said, is really worrying in the Palestinian community without, in addition to the settler colonial prism, is also like the securitization of Israel, and also the, what do you call it, the treatment of Palestinians as the enemy, like, like we're citizens, but we like reside in this kind of dialectics of citizens, but also enemies, like being treated as enemies at the same time, and the implication that this has on the way we are being governed. And violence, we cannot like ignore it, that it's like, it's the enemy from within, like let them kill each other, you know what I mean? And there is the lack of accountability in that way, that these criminals who are roaming free, because they know, that there is no accountability, and they are also collaborating with the system that is supposed to be holding them, to account. Another aspect I would say that we cannot also ignore, the shifts within the Palestinian society in Israel, and being part of a global trend that is to do with the neoliberal, agendas, and the neoliberal way of living, and the shifting away from, like collective kind of, modes of being, and, the adaptation of the consumerist kind of society, and the lack of consciousness in that way about, you know, where do we want to go, and those youngsters who are, you know, part of these gangs are you know, are attracted by the allure of, like, you know, commodities and capital and money and etc. etc. So it's a combination of things which we're up against. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Manal. I fully agree. And regarding, like, you know, this is a very, it's very popular idea, the spillage, you know, that it's something that is being spilled from the outside, and even within our communities, right? If you have a crime in Al-Fahim, they'll say, they're not really from this town, they come from, you know, that town and do crime here and so on. And of course, it's because these are like would be small communities and small villages where people kind of know each other. I think what we forget is that crime is it's an international phenomenon, right? It happens everywhere. I remember this very nice sentence that Haneen Zoabi once said in one of the parliamentary sessions. She said, if there's a rise in crime in New York, you know, people will not say what has happened to the New Yorkers, are they crazy? They will say what is happening to the New York Police Department, what is going on, right? When we see rise of crime within our communities, people are like, what is it with the Palestinians? Have they gone crazy, right? But you never hear this about Chicago or New York or any other, or London, you know, or any other town. So of course, there's this tendency to blame the people rather than to blame how the system is being operated from the first place. How come year after year we are seeing this? And yes, just as you said, Nehaya, and 2 weeks ago, they say we cannot fight crime because these are our people, basically. These are our collaborators. They are the one doing the, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Osama. Thank you very much. Thank you for the comments, Manal. And I think we are now should move to the next presentation by Dr. Benjamin Bouquet. I think I'm pronouncing his name in the right way, I hope. Benjamin is a medical doctor specialized in public health and working with the World Health Organization in the occupied Palestinian territory. And he's going to talk with us about precarity and health, a mixed method study into households affected by displacement and demolition in East Jerusalem. Please, Dr. Benjamin. The floor is yours.
Hello, my name is Ben Bouquet, and I'll be presenting this abstract on behalf of Manal Masaha, Juliana Nassar, Bashar Natche, and Rita Jacquemin. Our abstract is entitled Precarity in Health, a mixed method study into households affected by displacement and demolition in East Jerusalem. By way of background, healthy housing is shelter that supports a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, providing a feeling of home, including a sense of belonging, security, and privacy. This is according to WHO Housing and Health Guidelines 2018. Conversely, housing precariousness, insecurity, and precarity adversely affect health. And we'll be exploring those concepts more in this presentation. In East Jerusalem, discriminatory planning and zoning policies affect Palestinians, with just 13% of land in the Israeli-defined Jerusalem municipality, the eastern part of the Jerusalem municipality, allocated for Palestinian use, as opposed to 35%, which is allocated for Israeli settlements. This leads to overcrowding and to poor housing conditions. There is a coercive environment which entails limitations on development and difficulties obtaining permits for Palestinians. Also, the policy of demolitions and displacement, with over 2,500 Palestinians displaced in East Jerusalem between 2009 to 2020. And it also entails insecurity of residency, with more than 14,000 Palestinians losing their right to reside in East Jerusalem since 1967. If you include dependents of those who lost residency rights, then this number increases to more than 80,000. The objectives for this research were to explore the perceived impacts on health and well-being of lived experiences of home demolition and displacement in East Jerusalem, and also to assess the exposure to different forms of housing precariousness and occupation-related violence of women from Palestinian households in East Jerusalem, affected by home demolition and or displacement, and their self-reported health and well-being. In terms of methods, we conducted 10 case studies of families who were displaced or experienced home demolition from 2009 to 2016. Our sample was purposive, looking at experiences of demolition or displacement, the housing trajectory of those families, and then also looking at age, gender, and disability. And this was drawing on a demolition database that is kept by OCHA as a registry of households experiencing demolition or displacement. And the case studies used semi-structured interviews, site visits, and visual ethnography with photography. The second component was quantitative and used surveys. Here we looked at a more recent sample of households from the same OCHA database from 2017 to 2018 with systematic random sampling, which selected 120 households for survey, of which there was a response rate of 70%. So in the end, we surveyed 84 women of households. And I'll go into the different components of those surveys in the results. They included demographics, housing precariousness, occupation-related violence, human insecurity, and self-reported physical, mental health and well-being. For the qualitative aspect of the study, looking at perceived health impacts, these could be split into four main mechanisms by which health was impacted by experiences of demolition or displacement. First was the impact of the event. This included the impact particularly that was focused on the experiences of children. So for example, in this quote, Mohammed, who was 6, doesn't sleep by himself now. After 4 years, we still feel unsettled and lost. We're still homeless. Children were reported to be experiencing sleeplessness, bedwetting, becoming more withdrawn, and also panicking. And there was also an impact that was reported on academic performance of children. The adults who were interviewed themselves reported feeling depressed, frustrated, unstable, also insecure, unsafe, and anxious. And there was also an economic impact of the event, which had itself an effect on health. This included the cost of demolition, which is incurred by the municipality and then charged to the family. So that some families reported having to pay back monthly installments for the demolition of their households. And this would be over a matter of years on a monthly basis, which contributed to indebtedness and feelings of being out of control. Housing quality was another mechanism by which health was perceived to be impacted, particularly looking at the overcrowding of houses with adjectives used such as cramped, pressured, trapped, incarcerated. Here the quote says, "We have 6 children all in this pokey house with hardly any fresh air or sunlight. I feel stifled here and easily irritated. The children feel confined and cooped up." There was also a health impact of the structural aspects of housing. So one participant commented that buildings are not inspected and there are no safety checks. In winter, water seeps through the building and we're at risk of electrocution. This was particularly an issue that was highlighted in areas outside of the walls, such as Kafr Aqab or Shafat refugee camp, where construction has been concentrated for Palestinians in recent years. And there was a perception that the actions of developers in these areas were exploitative and not considerate of residents. So one participant saying that all construction is motivated by profit making, and there's not consideration for the residents in the area. A third mechanism related to this is the neighborhood or the environment, where there are a number of aspects of that were perceived to be impacting on health. One was again related to the previous point, the unregulated nature of the development, resulting in cramped housing conditions. One participant saying that 100,000 people and not a single playground. A lack of security or the lawlessness in these areas was also highlighted, so particularly those such as Kafr Aqab and Shafat refugee camp. This quote says, "It's miserable here." This was talking about Shafat refugee camp. "There's no security or personal safety. People are neglected, and so is the infrastructure. There are no services. Everything is missing." There was also perceived lack of social cohesion and trust in the areas that people had moved to. So again, the areas outside of the wall. And there was a lack of services and amenities that are pointed to in this quote. This included regular water cuts, which were perceived to impact on health and hygiene. And then fourthly, affordability, tenure, and legal protections were seen, or lack of legal protections were also seen to impact on health and feelings of control. So one participant saying that this is a sheer political act. How can they evict someone from a house he lived in for 53 years? All their courts are a sham. I feel like I'm about to explode. So pointing to this feeling of lack of control, lack of protection, and the stress that entailed. Another aspect relating to affordability, one participant said, "You need millions to live in Jerusalem. My monthly income is 5,000 shekels. More than half of this goes on rent, before bills, and the arnona, which is the council tax." So pointing to the unlivability and the unaffordability, and this participant expanded on the stress that this contributed to. In terms of the quantitative component of the research, we first looked at the issue of housing precariousness. And this is defined by Claire et al. As having four main components: housing security, housing affordability, housing quality, and then access to services. The different components that we looked at, so of course, all of the households had experienced demolition or displacement, but nearly a quarter had experienced two or more incidents of demolition or displacement. Again, relating to security of residency is about security of residency rights as well. More than 1 in 20 women, and then more than 7% of their family members of women had lost their residency rights to remain in East Jerusalem. In terms of affordability, over a quarter of the households, the head of the household was unemployed, and there were high reported over-indebtedness, so more than more than 2/3 of households missing payment of debt, and over 50% of women reporting that they worry daily about the debt of the household. In terms of housing quality, reflecting again the qualitative findings, there were reports of overcrowding, and 2/5 of respondents indicated that there were 3 or more persons per room in their household, which is an indication of overcrowding, and also comes within the definition of slum housing by WHO and the UN Habitat. In terms of access to services, around 1/5 of participants reported at least one physical or geographical barrier to accessing healthcare, and 1 in 10 reported cost barriers. There were high rates of occupation-related violence. So, for example, 1/5 of women reported that they themselves had experienced acts that resulted in their humiliation, and 2/5 reported that their family members had experienced humiliating acts. This was measuring incidents of violence or subjective violence as opposed to structural forms of violence. And this participant from Silwan commented in the qualitative aspect of the study that although we have rights and we have access to health services, we get them with humiliation, pointing to the more structural form of humiliation that exists. Other experiences of occupation-related violence included detention and arrest, which particularly affected the family members of the women who responded to the survey. So more than 1/5 of women reporting that family members had been detained or arrested, while only 1% of women themselves had been. And this points to the gender disparity in detention and arrest, which tends to affect Palestinian men and boys. Then finally, the survey looked at issues of experiences rather of human insecurity and at self-reported health and well-being. So human insecurity itself is a measure that looks at 3 main elements of a sense of home and basic needs, sense of or ties to family and community, and also hopes or hopelessness for the future. Nearly a half of women who responded had high or severe levels of human insecurity, and nearly a third had moderate levels of human insecurity. For self-reported health, the SF12v2 tool was used. The cutoff there is 50, and you can see that the mean for both the physical score, the PCS, and the mental health score, the MCS, fell below that 50 mark, with mental health scores falling below those of physical health. For the WHO Wellbeing Index, again, the cutoff there was 50, and you can see that the mean falls well below that at 28.1, with a standard deviation of 20, showing that this is significantly different from the cutoff. Strengths of this study: the framework of precarity is a very strong one, and it indicates different aspects of precarity were explored within the study, so housing precariousness in particular, but also other aspects such as occupation-related violence and human insecurity. This issue of demolitions and displacement, but also the general experience in East Jerusalem, is a critical one that affects Palestinians who live there. Our transdisciplinary approach provided different lenses and a strength and a much richer picture than we would have got had we just done the survey. And this was a well-defined population derived, as mentioned, from the LPHA database. Limitations of the study: there are a few comparators in terms of time, place, and person to understand some of the quantitative results, and the sample size was too small for correlation. There are, of course, biases related to selection bias and self-reporting, and the validity of some of the tools is difficult. So self-reported health, for example, the cutoff for the SF12 was 50, which is derived from the US population. So the cross-cultural applicability of that needs more investigation and consideration. And these were subjective outcome measures only. Objective measures would also be needed. So in conclusion, impacts on health, or perceived impacts on health, resulted from the event, from the housing trajectory, from the environment, and the political context. There's a high frequency of housing precariousness and occupation-related violence among women of households who'd experienced demolition and displacement. And there was also high reported human insecurity, poor well-being, and relatively low self-reported mental and physical health. Implications for policy: there are significant unmet health needs and barriers to access for this population. Prevention is key, and there it's important to emphasize Israel's responsibilities for the discriminatory planning and demolitions and the impacts that those are having. And there it's also important to engage in health advocacy and to call for actions of third states and for increased accountability for the right to health of Palestinians. In terms of implications for research, the linking of measures of precarity, precariousness, and insecurity are important. And while the concept of insecurity has been well investigated in the context of Palestine, ones of precarity and precariousness tend to focus more on the welfare states and don't account so much for settler colonialism. So there's potential further work that could be done there. Self-reported health, as mentioned, the comparators are for other populations such as the American population, and there's a need for objective measures of health needs and impacts. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bouquet. Very interesting and important and relevant, I would say, a presentation. We know all about the events, the political violence in Sheikh Jarrah, Silwan, and East Jerusalem in recent months, and for many years actually, but especially in the recent months. I would like to open now the discussion if you have any questions to Dr. Bouquet. If not, I have a question, maybe while you prepare yourselves. We have studied actually internal displacement among Palestinians in the Green Line and the intergenerational effects after 60 years of the occupation of the lands. And my question to you, Dr. Bouquet, is about the intergenerational effect. If you have studied this in your research, or you just looked cross-sectionally about the events and what is happening right now. Because we know that, the especially mental health effects could last also to the second and third generation. And we know that many of the Palestinians still suffer from the post-trauma of the Nakba. And now adding also confiscation of lands and house demolition, this can exacerbate the situation, the mental health effects among them. So did you study this in your research?
Thanks, Nehaya. Actually, this wasn't a specific focus of the research that we carried out in terms of addressing intergenerational effects. Although the qualitative aspect of the study looked at the household as a whole, and of course many households had different generations that were living in them. And maybe I have also, I should say as well, the colleagues for the research are also online. So Manal, in case she wants to expand on that, the qualitative aspect. Yeah, for the survey, I think I went through all of the different aspects of what was covered there, and it wasn't specifically addressing that. But I'd be interested to hear more and read more about how you approached that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Manal.
Yeah, actually, I have something to say here. First of all, thank you, Ben. That was a fantastic presentation. In regard, Nehaya, to the intergenerational thing, and we did have in the qualitative aspect of it some families which actually were displaced themselves in 1948, especially that picture that Ben showed of the old man and his son and his wife, and those were refugees displaced in 1948 and then forcibly displaced in 2017 and then 2009. They're from Sheikh Jarrah. And for them, it was actually interesting to see or to hear from them at the time that like the intergenerational aspect was not actually an element that we thought that we want to investigate, because it's a different kind of research in that way. But that man, the Shamasni family and also the Ghawi family, they were like totally and utterly devastated by the experience of the second displacement, more so than the first 1948. For them, the impact of the like being forcibly evicted from their home in Sheikh Jarrah, even if it was like a tiny pokey little house, but for them it's the home that where they live was far more impactful in that way on them than the experience of 1948. And the man who was at the time, I don't know if he's still alive actually, because we conducted the research or the qualitative aspect of the research in 2017. He was totally depressed, refusing to take his medication. For him, the injustice of 2017, as I said, was way higher. And if you think about it, actually, it is, because you can see the injustice like in you're experiencing it in your body, and you're seeing it like how, you know, like the police and the security forces come and evict you from your home, that where you had your family, where you lived for, you know, for tens of years, and etc., etc. And then like a young family of settlers coming with their chutzpah, you know, like and entering the household. So it was really like you can see it also. I think the image conveys that, you know, the heaviness of the situation. So yeah.
Thank you, Manal. This is very important and informative also. The suffering is really, really great and high here in this. We were studying this also, a topic about house demolition among Bedouin women, and studying anxiety and depression among them. And it's really very frustrating. So thank you, Manal, and thank you, Ben, for your presentation. So we come to the end of our session, I think, and I would like to thank you all for attending this session. Thank you for the presenters. Dr. Tanous and Dr. Bouquet, and thank you, Iman, for your comments on both presentations. I'd like now to introduce Dr. Iman and Wahid for the next session about political violence and mental health. So it is continuing our session, actually. Thank you.